All right, guys, final wrap up on the 74 caliber top lever PCP pistol. Um, yeah, basically it was a disaster and a nightmare. Once I figured out this was a casting, which was when I was threading for the valve, for the internal valve as part of the block, I was like, this is tapping way too easily, especially for a big tap. It was like M24. That's when I knew. And then, after that, threads started stripping out with like almost no torque. So I was like, this is a nightmare, but I was already so far into it as far as hogging out material and everything. And because of that, I had to design a valve system that connected direct to the air tube. And because of that, the air tube ended up further out than the barrel. It's just one thing after the next. The one thing I can say is that the top lever was an awesome idea. And like the mechanics at the back, as far as like the pivot point and how everything interacts, was just so much easier than a side lever. Not to mention, you could like pull the hammer and spring out while you had the lever installed, which would be impossible. Well, you could do the spring, but you definitely couldn't pull the hammer out with a conventional side lever installed. It just wouldn't work. With the top lever, you just have so much flexibility. So I really like that. If I could figure out a way to, mount sights either on the top lever or around it somehow, or have the top lever, imagine if it was offset to this side and then your sight rail was coming up on the other side. Like the old Russian style offset scopes or whatever. There's probably a way to do it. I just haven't looked into it too much. What else? As far as like the power and tuning, I got up to like 206 foot-pounds, and later on, off camera, I did port it out. But the port, if anything, it took away a little bit of power because, I think I had everything almost ideal for that 200 plus foot-pound shot, and I've got a bunch of others that aren't, that weren't on video. With the smaller port, you just simply, people always say, oh, well, the poppet diameter, that's going to determine how much force it takes to open the valve. Really, it's the throat diameter, because that's where you have the atmospheric pressure fighting versus the inside of the valve, which is whatever pressure it is. So when I went up in throat diameter and porting, I wasn't getting as much valve dwell or duration. Not to mention when you port, you have let's say you port out a transfer port up to the barrel. You now have a larger volume. Of space going up to the barrel. So what effectively happens is the poppet comes forward, the air goes in, and you're wanting to get that full 3,000 psi behind the pellet. But it's continually dropping as it expands in every direction that it possibly can. Well, if you open up the porting, you need a lot more flow now, because now the air is expanding into a much larger volume and the pressure is dropping, more substantially. So unless you have the flow to match the porting, unless you have the dwell, it's very hard to keep your chamber pressure or pressure behind the pellet the same. So I would have been better off staying with the .375 transfer port. Yes, it still works with the .437, but it's not ideal because I just can't flow enough to keep that chamber pressure high enough by the time it goes, through the valve, up into the transfer port, and to the back of the pellet. It just it wasn't beneficial. Now, with other designs, maybe it would be. If this was a balanced valve design, it would probably be beneficial. If I had more hammer energy in a conventional design, yes, it would probably be beneficial. If I had made a less dramatic jump, like maybe from 375 to 10 millimeter, let's say if I had a 10 millimeter reamer or something lying around, that might have been beneficial, but I think I jumped too high and I definitely didn't have the dwell to support it. But yeah, there was all types of little problems. For a while, I thought I had a leak past one of these bolts right here, and there was bubbles coming out. So I would take it apart, reseal it, retest it, take it apart, reseal it, retest it. I probably did about 10 different O-rings on it, all to find out after an overnight test that it wasn't a leak. It's that when I submerged it, the O-ring is all the way up here. So the bubbles were actually coming from just that gap, between the air tube and the block. It was just the last of the bubbles, but I kept mistaking it for a leak. Because they always seem to come out of one side for whatever reason. But then one night I just left it alone, and when I went back into the shop, I just cocked it and fired it, and there was still a lot of air in there. So I said, well, it must not have been a leak. But yeah, that was a big waste of time. And the other thing was initially, filling this thing, even though it's only 260 cc's, I think. Filling it was a nightmare because I wanted to use, back to the whole dwell idea, I wanted to use the lightest poppet valve spring possible, which is the spring that's holding the poppet on the seat. I wanted to use the lightest one possible. But when you do that and you go to, unless you have a big SCBA tank and you're filling instantly, if you go to fill with a compressor or hand pump, you don't have enough pressure on the poppet to fully seat it. So when I was filling this, turn on the compressor, all hooked up, and there'd be bubbles coming past the poppet until I got to about 1500 psi. So to fill this from scratch was always a nightmare, starting from zero. Filling from 25 to 3000 is easier, 2000 to 3000, because everything's holding air, because I already have that ambient pressure seating the poppet. But filling from zero was just an absolute nightmare. So yeah, it's a gun that's best left with at least 1500 psi in it for storage. And there's been manufactured guns that flopped because of that issue. For example, the Benjamin Rogue back in 2012-ish. When that came out, everybody was all excited. It was an electronic 357 from Crosman with a warranty, and at the time, 140 foot-pounds was phenomenal. Because big bores weren't really a big thing. I mean, people were building them, but like any big bore, from one of the custom builders that were around, these are guys in a small shop. Some of them would cost thousands of dollars, and not necessarily nowhere near competitive with the power levels today. But the Rogue, everybody had hand pumps at the time. These $200 Chinese compressors weren't around. So people quickly figured out, and I think Crosman put it out at the time, you could not fill with a hand pump because you needed that air pressure to seat the valve. You needed an instant, a burst from a tank to seat the valve. So, that killed a huge part of the market share because, the tanks and the filling equipment to do it and everything and going to the scuba shop, there was probably only a small percentage of the forums were using tanks at the time. Maybe not a small percentage, maybe 30% had tanks and all the equipment and everything else. So yeah, it was a different era. But the gun, basically, part of the reason it flopped, I would assume, is because it wasn't really available to most people that just had hand pumps. And at the time, hand pumps, although we know them now to be like an expendable commodity, they were like $150, or I think the Crosman one was like $200 at the time. Hand pumps were expensive enough, so not many people were willing to make the jump to, especially not a compressor, but people would take their tanks to, scuba shops and get them filled there. And it just became, it just looked like a hassle for most consumers to go out and get an electronic Rogue, that couldn't be filled outside of a tank setting. So anyway, back to this gun. I don't know what I'm doing next, but I do know I have a really cool gun that I just ordered, and it should be coming next week, and I'm going to do some reviews and teardowns on that, and I'm going to try to modify it and add a longer barrel and all this other stuff. I plan on making like a dual tank setup for it, so that's going to be interesting. And I have another build that I'm posting in the shorts. It's just a little 25 caliber single shot, but like somewhat miniaturized, super lightweight. The air is going to be in the grip. It could be interesting, or it could be terrible. I don't know, but I'm building it because I have like a week until this other gun shows up. So it'll keep me occupied and, give you guys something to watch, I guess. What else about the 74 caliber? If I had to do it all over again, obviously I would have started with the aluminum I usually buy, which is, at least 60-61 quality. The side lever, I would have figured out some kind of sighting system, but this thing's, impossible to aim. You're better off hip shooting it because it's just so heavy, and there's so much recoil, and it's just too much craziness. It might actually be effective as like a pistol shotgun. That would be kind of cool if I had 3D printed shot shells and just loaded 50 BBs in each one. This thing would probably be pretty hairy. If I had to do it over, I probably would have done a longer barrel, a balanced valve, a smaller air tube. I wouldn't need 260 cc's. I don't need a bunch of shots. I probably would have done, maybe under 200, like just under 200 cc's, which would reduce the weight. Or I would have set it up originally for a tank and just had like a 13 cubic inch right here. And that would have kept it maybe a little bit lighter, definitely lighter, and maybe a bit shorter. Yeah, if the block was made out of regular aluminum, I'd probably still be improving this thing. But it just got so aggravating. I do like this army green though. It's got some weird texture, and the odd part is, since it's army green camouflage, it says on the can, it does come up with its own like color patterns as you're spraying. Let me see if I could flip this over. Yeah, you could see it a little bit, but it's got like some brown in there, and it's got like a gritty texture. What I should have probably clear coated it with some polyurethane just to make it tougher. It's not durable at all. I could probably scrape it off with my fingertip, and it's been drying for 24 hours. What else? I guess that's about it. This was just a bent piece of steel, but I kind of like the look of actually having a trigger guard. I think my last couple builds haven't had one. Yeah, it was just, I forget what even the brackets were for, but I just bent it up and it caused all the paint to scrape away, and then I just resprayed it and it came out looking fine. And that's about it. I'm going to upload this, and thanks for watching. If you guys have any ideas on how this could have been done differently with the top lever, like how it could have been configured differently, definitely share in the comments. All right.